On today's show, it's an emergency edition of Locked On Cavs. DeAndre Hunter traded to the Sacramento Kings. Keon Ellis and Dennis Schroeder are now members of the Cavs. We'll talk about it on this edition of Locked On Cavs.
You are Locked On Cavs, your daily Cleveland Cavaliers podcast.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi again, everybody. My name is Danny Cunningham, and I cover the Cleveland Cavaliers over at my Substack, The Inside Shot, and you're listening to an emergency edition of Locked On Cavs, which, of course, is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network in all of America. You can find this show and any other Locked On podcast anywhere you get them. That's Apple, that's Spotify, that is YouTube as well. If you're watching right now on YouTube, please do us a favor, hit that thumbs up button for us and click the notification bell as we get started, and make sure that you are subscribed wherever you might be listening to this show. And today's emergency edition of Locked On Cavs is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON, that is LOCKEDON, for $20 off your first purchase. The Cleveland Cavaliers make the second trade of the NBA season on Saturday night as they trade DeAndre Hunter to the Sacramento Kings in exchange for Keon Ellis and Dennis Schroeder. Also, as part of this deal, Dario Saric is going from Sacramento to Chicago for 2 second-round picks. One of those picks is actually Sacramento's second-round pick. So the Cavs are really getting this done. They're getting the gist of this trade from a Cavs perspective is they're trading DeAndre Hunter and a second-round pick in exchange for Keon Ellis, who I think was a top target not only on their board, but on a lot of boards across the NBA. I heard that over 10 teams had made offers to Sacramento for Ellis, and the Cavs are the ones that have won that bidding war, and Dennis Schroeder. I think both guys can help. We'll talk about why that is, why the DeAndre Hunter experiment just did not work in Cleveland, and why I think that the Cavs are probably not done making moves before the trade deadline on Thursday. But let's talk about the guys they acquired, because Keon Ellis has been one of the bigger names on the market, but it's been a weird situation because he's not exactly in Sacramento's every night rotation. And the Kings previously kind of fired Mike Brown because Brown wouldn't play Keon Ellis. And it's like been a very weird ride in Sacramento. And I do think that it's fair to say this guy couldn't play for the Kings. Why would we expect him to come in and play for the Cavs, a team that entered this season with championship expectations? And I think that would be a fair thing to say if the Kings weren't the Kings, right? Like the fact that he's in and out of the rotation. And it's not like he's been collecting a ton of DNP CDs. Like he has played 40 games, but his minutes are low so far this year. And he did not play when the Kings were in town against the Cavs last week. But I do think it's fair to look at that and just say, well, he's not good enough to like be an impact player in the Kings. Why would it work here? Well, I think the situation has a lot to do with that, and the Kings being the Kings. And I don't want to like punch down there, but I do think that's part of it. I think that this is an opportunity that the Cavs and a lot of other teams see as that guy will be better when he's not in Sacramento. And what I think that Ellis will provide for the Cavs is, one, I think there's a good chance that he goes down as the best player in this trade. Now, we'll talk about why DeAndre worked last year in Cleveland, didn't work this year in Cleveland, coming up in segment number 2. But I think that what Keon Ellis can provide, one, he will be a better defender than what DeAndre Hunter was here in Cleveland. Hunter was, to his credit, a really, really strong defender in isolation. There were not a lot of isolation situations in which he wasn't very good. However, whenever a second player was brought into the action in off-ball situations, he was kind of pretty bad in those spots defensively. And I would expect overall the defensive experience with Keon Ellis to be a better one for the Cavs. And I think this is something that you kind of look at in some ways. This isn't a replacement of DeAndre Hunter, because I do think that the Cavs are going to try and get that production from other spots on the roster now. Like this opens up more minutes for Naquan Tomlin. This opens up a little bit more responsibility for Dean Wade. Like those things are all true. But I look at this and say Keon Ellis is the guy, because obviously they traded Isaac Okoro after not necessarily loving what he was able to bring to the table offensively, and just the fact that he was a minus on that end of the floor and somebody that would not be guarded in the postseason. They traded him for Lonzo Ball, which has not worked out whatsoever. And Keon Ellis is neither of those players specifically. Like he is a different player than those guys. But I think he can fill that role in a better way than those guys could. That is something that I think that the Cavs kind of have in mind here. I think that they look at him and yes, he's not a super high volume shooter, but he is a good shooter from beyond the 3-point arc. In his career, he's shooting so far in the 3+ years, because he hasn't played 4 full years yet. He's shooting 41.6% on threes. Now, it's low volume. He's shooting 3.5 per game, so it's not necessarily great. But I also do think that he's not played alongside somebody that is as good as Donovan Mitchell. He's not played alongside somebody like Darius Garland that can create better looks for him. I do think that we could see a boost in his shooting production being in Cleveland compared to being on the team that he was in Sacramento. And I do think, too, there is something to be said. And we saw this with DeAndre last year, actually. And I think it's a good point to bring up. There is something to be said about going from the actual worst team in basketball. Like, the Kings have more losses than any other team in the NBA. As I record this at 11:52 on January 31st, they have more losses than anybody in the NBA. And going from that situation to a team that has a lot of belief and thinks that it can be the best team in the Eastern Conference can be a boost to your production. Like, I do think that we saw DeAndre Hunter play better in Cleveland last year because he was traded from a team that was going nowhere to a team that thought it could win the title last year in the Cavs. And I just do think that those things matter a little bit. I think that Ellis can handle the basketball a bit. I think that will be a benefit. Like, I think that this is something that is going to ultimately make the Cavs better on both ends of the floor. And I think that there are a lot of reasons to be excited about this trade if you're a Cavs fan. I think the financial aspect of this is certainly part of it. And we'll talk about that coming up in segment number 3, because I don't think the Cavs are going to be done here. And I think that if you look at sort of a paper trail here, I think it'll tell you why. But moving on to Dennis Schroeder too, because I think it's just important to look at this from all sides. He is obviously part of this trade. I cannot say, like, I don't think he was the priority for the Cavs to get. I think that Keon Ellis was the priority. And I think in order to get Keon Ellis without attaching more draft capital, because again, as I mentioned, the Cavs only gave up 1 second-round pick. One of these second-round picks, according to The Athletic, is from Sacramento going to Chicago. One of them is from the Cavs going to Chicago. So that's important to denote here. But Dennis Schroeder doesn't have a good contract. Like, there's some long-term money that I don't necessarily think the Cavs would love to have on their books moving forward. We'll see if he is on the team after next week. Like, I think it's greater than a 50-50 chance he is still in Cleveland next week. But if his name is floated, like if you hear in the next couple of days that, oh, actually the Cavs might reroute Dennis Schroeder somewhere else, that wouldn't be the most stunning thing to me. I'm not saying that I would predict that to happen, but I don't think that would be all that shocking. Now, he's not eligible to be aggregated with another player. The Cavs still cannot aggregate players in a trade because they are still a second apron team, despite this deal having some positive financial outcomes for the Cavs. But if Schroeder is here, I think that he can take a lot of the backup point guard burden away from what hasn't been working, because the Lonzo Ball experiment has gone horribly for the Cavs. Like, there's no nice way to say it. He's just not been the player that the Cavs thought they were going to get. And Dennis Schroeder, while he's much smaller than Lonzo, like Lonzo is a legitimate 6'6", and his size has been a plus for the Cavs, and what he's done defensively has been good. The rebounding's been good, and Schroeder's not going to provide those things. But he is a much more of a positive player on the offensive end of the floor for the Cavs than what Lonzo is. Like, he's not a great shooter, but he's also not the actual worst three-point shooter in basketball the way that Lonzo Ball has been so far for the Cavs this year. So I do think that this can sort of provide more of a punch. I think it takes some of the burden off of Craig Porter Jr. I don't know if those two can necessarily play a ton together because they're both smaller guards. Like, Schroeder is listed at 6'1". He's not the biggest guard in the world. I don't know that his time in Sacramento has gone all that well. Obviously, he was a very good player for the Detroit Pistons last year on a team that made the playoffs and pushed the New York Knicks to 6 games in the first round. So I do think that when he's in a winning situation, can he be a player that, like, elevates his game similar to what I said about Keon Ellis? Can that be something that really takes his game up another level when he's surrounded by better players as opposed to the roster that he's playing alongside in Sacramento? I mean, like, let's think back to just over a week ago when the Kings were in town and the Cavs played Sacramento and they won that game, and they started off that game 16-2. And then Doug Christie, the Kings head coach, made a hockey sub where he subbed out all 5 starters. I think it was 3 minutes and 20 seconds into the game, and 5 reserves came into the game, and Dennis Schroeder was one of them. And I'm not saying that he deserves all the credit, but he came into that game and he was very good for the Kings and part of the reason why they were able to make a comeback on the Cavs. So I look at that and say, well, who was he playing with there? Well, he was on the floor with Domantas Sabonis, who was coming off the bench because it was his first or second game back from injury that cost him like 6 or 7 weeks. I don't remember exactly what it was, but he missed a bunch of time. And he was playing with the Kings' best player, and you saw him have a positive outcome. So how can he maybe be a guy that when he's alongside some better players in Cleveland than what they have in Sacramento, is that going to be something that boosts his production level, that takes his play up another level? And I do think that overall, this is a positive move for the Cavs. I think they got better. I think they got the best player in this trade in what Keon Ellis will turn out to be. I also look at this and say Keon Ellis is somebody that the Cavs don't trade for unless they view as part of the future, because he is on an expiring contract. He's in the final year of his rookie deal, and he will be I believe, an unrestricted free agent this upcoming summer. And the Cavs, I don't think, make this move unless they have plans for him to be around long-term. This is a good opportunity to acquire somebody and their bird rights. Most importantly, the Cavs can go over the cap to sign him. I don't know what his market's going to be this summer, but the Cavs will have the advantage of being able to try and retain him in a way that they wouldn't be able to had they not traded for him. So overall, I think the Cavs got better with this move. And a big part of the reason why the Cavs got better is it just was not working with DeAndre Hunter this year. We'll talk about why that was next right here on Locked On Cavs. But first, today's show is brought to you by Gametime. There's nothing like being in an NBA arena, the crowd, the energy, the moment. Getting tickets, though, that part hasn't always been as easy as you'd like. And that's why Gametime has become the go-to app for scoring tickets fast without the hassle. It puts the advantage back where it belongs with you, the fan. Maybe next Wednesday, you want to be, not this next Wednesday, the Wednesday after. We have, unfortunately, far too long before your Cleveland Cavaliers are back in Cleveland, Ohio, playing a basketball game. They're on the West Coast for 4 more games here. But maybe you're going to want to see the new look Cavs, who will look much different the next time they're in Cleveland than they do right now. And if you want to be in the building when they take on the Washington Wizards on February 11th, Gametime is the way to get in the building. You can pull up the app, pick an upcoming game like that one, or maybe you live in one of the cities the Cavs are going to be in next. They will be in Sacramento very soon. They will be in Portland on Sunday night. They will be in Denver. They will be in Los Angeles. If you live in one of those cities and you're a Cavs fan and you want to go check out the Cavs, Gametime is the way to go. They will show you the all-in price up front, plus no surprise fees at checkout. Being able to see the view from your seat before buying will make the decision easy. So take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. That's code LOCKEDON, LOCKEDON, for $20 off your first purchase. Download the Gametime app today. And remember, it's gametime.co, not .com. Thank you again for making today's edition of Locked On Cavs your first listen. And if you are an everydayer, you want to check out the Locked On Cavs Everydayer Club, because if you need a group chat to keep up with the chaos that is happening as the NBA trade deadline approaches, ours is the one to join. The Everydayer Club gets you access to a group chat in Discord just for Cavs fans, plus national chats where you can come hang out with fans from all across the league. You can also get ad-free versions of this show. And if you sign up by the trade deadline on February 5th, you can use the code DEADLINE, that is DEADLINE, to get your first month for free. Tap the link in the show notes to learn more. So a big part of the reason why the Cavs made this trade is it just very clearly was not working with DeAndre Hunter. He was having the worst season of his career so far, and he was so good for the Cavs last year after they acquired him from the Atlanta Hawks, and he has been, I think, equally as bad this year, and that's like that necessitated them to make a move. And it's a bummer it didn't work out. I think that he's been the exact type of player that they had been looking for at that small forward position since LeBron James left for the Los Angeles Lakers 8 years ago. And for the final 30-plus games, and even the first round against the Miami Heat, and even in the second round before he dislocated his thumb against the Pacers, it looked like the Cavs had found that guy. And it didn't work out. He wasn't shooting the ball well. I thought he took a step back defensively. And I think that he said something earlier this year that really stuck with me. And I kind of look at it, and I don't want to say like, yeah, this is why it didn't work out, but it makes me wonder. And he had a quote where basically it was, when he was acquired last year, he felt like the Cavs wanted him, but he didn't feel like the Cavs needed him. And that was true. Like the Cavs were going to win 60 plus games last year, whether they traded for DeAndre Hunter or whether they didn't trade for DeAndre Hunter. Like that team was not going to, their floor without Hunter was where the same place they got in the playoffs anyways. Like they were no better because they got DeAndre Hunter. They were like they would not have been worse off had they not acquired DeAndre Hunter. He was a luxury for that group. He was a piece to try and push them over the top where they were close to being over the top. And you could make the argument they didn't need to make that move, that they were already good enough to win the championship. And you might have some fair points in that argument. And this year he felt like he was a necessity. And I think that was true. I think the Cavs needed DeAndre Hunter this year. And he did not live up to that end of the bargain. Like he was not good enough this season to be somebody that was a necessity. Like you have to, when you are counted on the way that the Cavs counted on DeAndre Hunter this year, you need to play better than he did. And sometimes I look at this because last year the Cavs had this luxurious roster, right? DeAndre Hunter was right about those comments. He was a luxury last year. He was a want. He was not a need. And this year, and I do wonder if the Cavs were not dealing with just numerous injuries all season long. Like let's say Darius Garland doesn't have the toe injuries. Let's say that Max Strus has played prior to right now this year. Let's say those things were true. Does DeAndre's season look different? Maybe. I don't know. We will never know. But the fact of the matter is that this wasn't going well enough. And the Cavs needed to make a move here because you can't make the argument that they were a better team with DeAndre than without DeAndre. And when you're making $22 million or $23 million, whatever his salary was, which we will talk about the financial implications of this deal coming up in a few minutes here. But when you're making that kind of money, you need to be somebody that is performing at that kind of level. And the Cavs were counting on Hunter to be one of their best players this year. And he just quite simply was not. His shooting had disappeared. His turnovers were, I mean, if you watch the game against the Phoenix Suns on Friday night, he had like just a couple passes where it's like, what are you doing type of passes. The one that he threw right to Dylan Brooks. Like I got a text from somebody with a different team who was watching that game that said that might be one of the worst passes I have ever seen an NBA player throw. And that was just kind of what the DeAndre Hunter experience was so far this season. Is he was underwhelming. He wasn't performing all that well. There would be these moments and spurts like the game against Charlotte where he had 27, the 2 games in Philly where he looked really good. It's like you could see the outline of how this should work, of why this should work. But it, unfortunately for him and for the Cavs, never truly came to fruition. I do wonder if the Cavs are part of the issue here too. I mean, the injury aspect of things, we will never know what that would have or would not have looked like. And I also wonder if him bouncing around between different roles had an impact on who he was as a basketball player this year. I do wonder if him being in the starting lineup at the start of the year was the wrong move. And it is something that he and Kenny Atkinson talked about. It was something they agreed upon would be best. And quite frankly, it didn't work out. He was not as malleable a player as I think the Cavs hoped that he would be. That I think everything that if you looked at who he was in Atlanta pointed to him being able to be. You know, maybe he goes out in Sacramento and looks like the guy who played for the Cavs last year. I don't know if that's going to be the case, but I do know that this got to the point, and I think DeAndre was frustrated. I think the Cavs were certainly frustrated with the way that he had played, but I just think it had gotten to a point where it was best for everybody to move on. And the fact the Cavs moved on, got a very good player in return in Keon Ellis, and only needed to spend 1 second-round pick in order to do so, I look at as a positive for the Cavs. Now, the Cavs have made one trade. I don't think this is the only trade that they're going to make. Maybe they make a small one. Maybe they make a big one. I'm not exactly sure, but we're going to talk through it next right here on Locked On Cavs. But first, today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. It's the last call for football on FanDuel. One final Sunday, one last kickoff. The final chance to get in on the action before the NFL season officially comes to a close. This is Super Bowl 60, and FanDuel is making sure you're right in the middle of it with a special offer just in time for the biggest game of the year. Whether you're backing the favorite, riding with the underdog, or building one last same-game parlay, this is the game that everybody has been waiting for. This is where predictions turn into plays, stats turn into storylines, and every snap, feels bigger than the one before. It's the perfect way to cap off the season and make the Super Bowl even more exciting from kickoff to the final whistle. If you're a new customer with FanDuel, bet just $5 and get $200 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet, and make it count, because after the Super Bowl, the football season, unfortunately, is over. So it's last call for football on FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of Super Bowl 60. Visit FanDuel.com. That is FanDuel.com to get started today. Thank you again for making today's edition of Locked On Cavs your first listen. Thank you to those of you that check out Locked On Cavs every single day. Appreciate you guys hanging out with me very early on this Sunday morning on this emergency edition of Locked On Cavs. So I do want to talk through the financial side of things, because I think that stuff is important. And I also think that this move points to the Cavs making at least one more trade prior to the trade deadline that is approaching on Thursday afternoon. So this trade between the Cavs and the Kings sends out DeAndre Hunter, returns Keon Ellis, returns Dennis Schroeder. This year, according to FanSpell, the Cavs will save $9.1 million in salary based on what Hunter was making. You know, you take Hunter's salary and send that to Sacramento, bring in Schroeder, bring in Ellis. It's a savings there of $9.1 million. That will also be around, I believe, $50 million in tax dollars. That's not something that I concern myself with all that much, because that's not a team building thing. So they entered this deal $22 million over the second apron. Now, we have all talked through the second apron, and we have talked through what restrictions that brings on team building and all of those things, right? You know, you cannot aggregate players if you're in the second apron. Cavs couldn't send out somebody else with DeAndre Hunter. It had to be just DeAndre. Now, they're $13.8 million over the second apron. So they have shaved off some of that money. Am I positive the Cavs are going to get out of the second apron? No, I'm not sure of that. However, I look at this and I think, okay, well, they're much closer to it. And they have now 15 guys on standard contracts. They're not going to, because they have to elevate Naquan Tomlin to a standard contract, whether it be converting his two-way deal into a minimum or signing him to a long-term deal, which is the hope for the Cavs. Like, they hope to sign him to a deal that kind of looks like the one that Craig Porter Jr. was originally on, or the one that Dean Wade was originally on, or the one that Sam Merrill was originally on. That's the kind of deal that they would like to have Naquan Tomlin on, but they are going to, from what I've been told, exhaust his games. And I believe he has 4 games left on his two-way. I've been told they're going to exhaust his games and then get him on an NBA contract so that he won't have those two-way restrictions anymore. Well, in order for that to happen, the Cavs will need to trade somebody else, because they have 15 guys on standard contracts right now. Lonzo Ball is the obvious name here, and Lonzo right now is making $10 million on what essentially is an expiring contract, because he has a team option for next year that if he were on the Cavs, like if the Cavs said, yeah, we're not going to trade you, they would decline that this summer, or wherever the Cavs, because I do believe they will trade him, wherever the Cavs trade him to, that team will just decline his $10 million option or include him in a trade this summer, because they could do that too. So that would then, because in all likelihood, they would trade Lonzo Ball for, I mean, maybe they find a trade where they get something back then more than a player on just a bet on a minimum contract. But in all likelihood, the Cavs will save a lot of money on that deal too. They will, if they do what I would expect them to do, which is to trade him for a veteran minimum contract. They will be able to use a veteran exception, which does not count against the apron. And they will then be down to just $3.8 million over the second apron. That then gets you in range of making a trade where you could aggregate players. Would I expect this to happen? I'm not quite there. However, I don't think it's outside the realm of the possibility that because the Cavs made this trade, that a bigger trade is not coming in the future. I don't think we can rule that out right now. Am I saying that I expect that? No, I'm not. But I'm also saying it's not a wild thought to think the Cavs couldn't be players for maybe a bigger name that could come available in the next few days. I think it's a possibility. I wouldn't say it's a strong possibility, but I think it's a possibility that they get down close enough to the apron where they are comfortable combining a couple of salaries from other guys that are still on the roster and then trading those guys for a bigger piece. I think that is a possibility that could happen within the next 5 days. I don't want to put like a percentage on how likely I think it is, but I don't think that percentage would be 0. That's all I'm going to say there. But this does save the Cavs money. This makes it easier for them if they so choose to get out of the second apron. Again, I think the priority number 1 is making this team better. I think that this trade accomplishes that priority. I think the Cavs right now are better as a basketball team than they were 2 hours ago. I think priority number 2 is saving money. And I think if you can accomplish both of those things in the same trade, I think that's a big win. And I think that is exactly what the Cavs pulled off on Saturday evening with the second trade of the NBA season. The first one was Trae Young from Atlanta to Washington. This is trade number 2, and there will be plenty of trades yet to come. Some of them probably will involve the Cleveland Cavaliers before the trade deadline arrives on Thursday afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern. And this will be the place for you to keep it locked in right here at Locked On Cavs. I will have you covered with everything that does happen, that doesn't happen. I will have everything you possibly could ask for right here at Locked On Cavs and over at my Substack, The Inside Shot. So I appreciate you hanging out with me very late on this Saturday night, early on this Sunday morning for this emergency edition of Locked On Cavs. You can find this show the same place you can find any other Locked On podcast, which is YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and any other podcast platform. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the thumbs up button for us, please, and click subscribe and the notification bell, and make sure you're subscribed anywhere else you might be listening. And I will talk to you no matter what tomorrow right here at Locked On Cavs.